Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are cracking open a story of, well, royal spectacle, ethnic threat, and survival against some truly astronomical odds.
We're diving into the Book of Esther.
And this is not just some ancient tale. It's really a masterclass in political maneuvering, high-stakes irony, and the absolute absurdity of unchecked power.
It is, and it's all wrapped up in this historical narrative set right in the heart of the Persian Empire. The source material we have today is just fantastic because it gives us the story, but it also gives us this, this precise historical and chronological scaffolding we need to really understand the drama.
So what's the time frame we're looking at?
The whole story spans about 10 years, just a decade of incredibly consequential history. It kicks off right around 483 BC and then wraps up by about 473 BC.
And that timing is so crucial for anyone trying to, place this in the broader context of Jewish history. We tend to think of the exile as this one single event, but this story, it happens well after the initial return.
Exactly. If you're following the larger story, this narrative slots right in between that first wave of exiles returning to Jerusalem, which you read about in Ezra chapters 1 through 6, and the later massive reforms.
The ones led by Ezra and Nehemiah.
Right,
Oh.
which you find in Ezra 7 through 10, and of course the entire book of Nehemiah. So we're dealing with a population of Jews who are still living pretty comfortably, maybe a little too comfortably, outside the Promised Land.
Right, in the diaspora.
Yeah.
So, okay. Our mission for this deep dive feels like it's twofold. We have to unpack the history, but also the theological framework.
That's it. First, we have to understand how this book manages, without ever actually naming God, to demonstrate his continuous providential care for people, even when they're living in compromise, outside of Palestine.
And second, we have to explain the exact origin and legacy of the Feast of Purim, which is, it's still celebrated globally today.
And we absolutely must start by setting the historical stage. And it is a vast stage.
The king at the center of all this drama is Ahasuerus.
Ahasuerus, yes. That's the Hebrew name for the Persian king Xerxes, who historians all pretty much agree is Xerxes I. He reigned from 486 to 464 BC, and he was the son of the great Darius I.
And the sources really make a big deal about the size of his empire, noting that he ruled 127 provinces.
Yeah, from India all the way west to Ethiopia. When the text says he ruled the known world, that is not an exaggeration. It's this absolutely enormous, diverse, and politically complex area.
It's staggering.
It was immense. The logistics alone of ruling a territory like that are hard to even imagine. Now, in secular history, Xerxes is famous for two major things that happened right around this time.
Okay, what are they?
First, his really ambitious, lavish building project, the royal palace at Persepolis. It was this huge symbol of his wealth and his power. And second, his historically disastrous campaign against the Greeks.
Ah, the famous one. That Greek campaign gives us an immediate historical marker for when this story begins, right? In Susa.
It does. Chapter 1 opens with this massive, drawn-out feast.
And what was the purpose of that feast? Was it just a big party?
Far from it. This is the key insight from the historical sources. The events described kick off in the winter of 483 to 482 BC, and the king is getting ready for what he sees as his great historical mission.
Which is?
To avenge his father Darius's humiliating loss at the Battle of Marathon back in 490 BC. Our sources strongly suggest that the 180-day feast described in Esther chapter 1, it wasn't a social gathering. It was this massive military rower, a fundraising and planning session.
Wow. So a global war cabinet meeting that just goes on for 6 months, that's an intense level of preparation.
It had to be. The Greek historian Herodotus, he corroborates this. He notes that Xerxes spent 4 years, from 484 to 481 BC, just preparing for this massive campaign that he hoped would finally conquer those pesky Greek city-states.
So all the spectacle we're about to get into, it's happening in the shadow of this colossal military buildup.
Yeah.
How did that campaign actually turn out for him?
Oh, it was a monumental, utter failure. In 481 BC, Xerxes led an army that some accounts say numbered close to 200,000 soldiers, hundreds of ships.
And he just got crushed.
A devastating threefold defeat at the hands of the Greeks. The Spartans beat his ground forces at Thermopylae, his main army was crushed at Plataea, and the Greeks just utterly destroyed his navy at Salamis.
So we begin this story with a king who, despite ruling the known world, is just consumed by the bitter sting of massive personal and imperial humiliation. His ego must be absolutely shattered.
It is, and that psychological fragility is the essential context for everything that happens next. His arrogance is just masking this profound insecurity.
Which brings us right to the first major scene, chapter 1, This is where the sheer absurdity of the Persian court is laid bare, but with some very serious consequences.
The satire is immediate and it's intentional, isn't it?
Yep.
The narrator is almost mocking this court.
It really feels like it. This king, ruler of 127 provinces, the entire known world, and he spends his time planning a 6-month banquet for his officials.
It's not just a dinner party. It's an excessive, lavish display. It's designed to prove his supremacy to subordinates he probably suspects of disloyalty, especially after the huge financial and logistical mess of the Greek campaign.
So the sources detail this 6-month banquet, and then there's another one.
Yes, followed by a 7-day public banquet for all the people of Susa, the city where the court resided.
The description of the party is just so cinematic. White linen, blue curtains, alabaster columns, golden containers.
But the most telling detail, I think you'll agree, is the royal wine, available in abundance with, and I quote, no restrictions on the drinking.
That detail is key. It establishes this total lack of restraint and control that really characterizes the whole Persian court. It's the height of pomposity. It shows the king is so secure, or wants to appear so secure, that he doesn't need to regulate anything.
Not even the alcohol consumption of his most powerful officials.
But you said earlier that this farce has a sinister side. How does all this buffoonery set the stage for genocide later on?
Well, this extreme excess and the lack of boundaries, it reveals a deeply dangerous society. It's ruled by people like the king and, later, Haman, whose tender egos and profound pride are capable of mobilizing the entire state machinery.
The laws, the military, the governors.
All of it, for selfish, childish, and vindictive causes. The machinery of the world's most powerful empire can be turned on a dime because the king had a bad day or because one person refused to bow.
And we see that immediately with the deposition of Queen Vashti. This happens right at the end of that public banquet in 482 BC.
Yes. On the 7th day, Ahasuerus has been drinking heavily. The text puts it delicately, he's feeling the effects of the wine.
Right.
And he orders his 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti, whose name ironically means the desired one, into his presence. The command was specific. She had to appear wearing her royal high turban just to display her beauty to his drunken officials.
It sounds like a moment of intense, just male objectification and humiliation disguised as a royal command.
Absolutely. And her refusal is an extraordinary moment of defiance. Vashti refused to come.
And Xerxes' reaction is instantaneous and probably proportional to the size of his bruised ego.
Exactly. He became extremely angry, consumed by rage. The sources show the speed with which a personal offense is transformed into a political crisis. He immediately convenes his cabinet-level officials, the wise men who were discerners of the times.
So the guys who understood law, custom, all the geopolitical implications.
The best in the business. But what's fascinating is that the crisis isn't framed as him being disobeyed. It's immediately framed as a crisis of patriarchal governance across the entire empire.
That's the genius of Memucan's advice.
It is. He wasn't just protecting the king, he was protecting the whole power structure. Memucan argued that Vashti's refusal was a threat not just to Ahasuerus, but to all the officials and, by extension, all husbands in all 127 provinces.
What was the core fear there? Was it a genuine concern for marriage or something a bit more self-serving?
It was purely self-serving fear of social collapse based on gender defiance. Memucan's logic was that if the queen, the highest aristocratic woman, disobeyed the king in public, the news would spread.
And that would lead to contempt from wives.
Specifically, the noble aristocratic ladies of Persia and Media. They feared it would cause a popular women's liberation movement, or at least a mini-revolution among the aristocratic wives. They saw this as a direct threat to their entire social standing.
So this isn't just a domestic squabble. It's a full-blown state emergency that requires the legislative power of the Persian Empire.
Exactly. And to counteract this perceived revolution, they passed an unrepealable law. This is the crucial concept of Persian governance. Once a law was written into the laws of Persia and Media, it could not be revoked.
So Vashti was formally banned from the king's presence. Her royalty transferred to someone more deserving.
But they didn't stop there. They passed a secondary law, which to me is the most revealing detail about the depth of their insecurity.
Yes, the language clause.
That's right. The secondary law stated explicitly that every man should be ruling his family and should be speaking the language of his own people. This was a legal maneuver to reinforce the husband's authority across all ethnic groups.
Why the language clause, though? What does that tell us about the Persian Empire's makeup?
It tells us they were grappling with multiculturalism. In ethnically mixed marriages within an empire as vast as Persia, the mother's native language often became the language of the home of the children.
So by passing this law, they were trying to mandate that the father's language, the official language, would prevail.
It was a massive state effort to maintain patriarchal and cultural authority across a vast, heterogeneous empire, and all of it triggered by one queen refusing a drunken command.
The king acts on this advice because it satisfies his ego and seems to maintain order. It just demonstrates how easily the state can be mobilized for purely selfish causes rooted in fragile male pride.
And that fragility, that readiness to punish an entire class of people for an individual offense, is the dark shadow under which Esther will eventually have to operate.
Okay, let's transition now, moving forward a year or two. We have the search for a new queen. Ahasuerus is back from his humiliating Greek defeat, so he's probably feeling even more insecure.
Right. The search begins around 481 BC. He returns to Susa feeling bitter, regretful. The sources suggest that after his rage subsided, he actually did have second thoughts about deposing Vashti.
But he couldn't take it back. The law was unrepealable.
He was stuck, but he needed a queen, to project stability and continue the royal line.
And his attendants propose a kingdom-wide search for attractive young virgins to replace her. These women were gathered to the harem in Susa under the authority of Hegai, the king's eunuch, for a very lengthy preparation.
And this is where we meet our central characters, Esther and Mordecai.
Right, so Mordecai was a Jewish man living in Susa, a Benjaminite.
Yes, a descendant of the exiles taken from Jerusalem with King Jeconiah way back in 597 BC, which means his lineage was likely tied to the old Judean nobility. He sat at the king's gate, which implies he held some kind of lower-level administrative or security position, a position of trust.
And Esther, or Hadassah, was his cousin, the daughter of his uncle.
She was an orphan, and Mordecai raised her as his own daughter. Her Jewish name, Hadassah, means myrtle, a plant often associated with peace and thanksgiving.
And her Persian name, Esther, means star.
Likely derived from the root of Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of love. The very fact she had two names, one kept secret, speaks volumes about her compromised position in the diaspora.
And this brings us to a crucial point for understanding the book's theological tension: the choice not to return to Jerusalem.
Yes. By this time, that first wave of about 50,000 Jews had already gone back to Palestine under figures like Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple.
So the call had gone out.
The call of God and the prophets had been clear: return and rebuild the nation. But most Jews, including Esther and Mordecai, chased the opposite. Our sources emphasize that they preferred the comfort and convenience of life in exile.
They had established lives there, businesses, homes.
Exactly. A relatively stable life in the Persian metropolis, which they favored over the financial strain, the hardship, the privation involved in obeying God's call to return to a struggling, war-torn Palestine.
And that choice comfort over commandment, it really defines their early actions in the story.
Absolutely. Their actions are marked by compromise, which extends right into Esther's time in the palace leading up to her coronation in 479 BC.
The preparation process for these women was mandatory and incredibly intense. A 12-month cosmetic treatment.
A full year of spa treatments, basically. 6 months with oil of myrrh, then 6 months with perfume and various expensive ointments. After this year, they'd go to the king for one night.
And if they weren't chosen?
They were moved to a separate harem for concubines, not to return to the king unless he specifically requested them by name. It was a conveyor belt of human potential leading to a luxurious but confined existence.
Esther, though, she quickly found favor. She pleased Hegai, the eunuch in charge.
She demonstrated remarkable grace and wisdom. The sources specifically highlight that she did not request anything beyond what Hegai recommended.
So she understood protocol. She was reading the situation.
She had this natural charm, an innate intelligence in navigating this dangerous court. She understood that humility and quiet obedience were her greatest assets. And the most important act of obedience was to Mordecai's instruction. She kept her lineage and people a complete secret.
A double life.
A complete double life. Her secrecy and her submissiveness to Mordecai's instructions mark her as a wise woman, but also one who is fully complicit in the compromise of assimilating into Persian culture.
So after 4 years of searching, a period marked by that crushing defeat by the Greeks, Esther was taken to the king in the 10th month, Tebeth, of the 7th year of his reign, 479 BC.
And the outcome was clear. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She met with his loving approval, and he made her queen. The text tells us he prepared a large banquet in her honor and even granted a holiday for the provinces to celebrate.
But let's go back to that difficult thematic tension. Her rise to power came at a profound cost to traditional Jewish piety, didn't it?
It did. Our sources contrast her actions sharply with figures like Daniel, who famously refused to defile himself with Babylonian food or compromise his prayer life.
Esther, by necessity, cooperated with practices that ran counter to the Mosaic law.
Things like eating unclean food, having sexual relations with a pagan king, and most significantly, keeping her Jewish identity secret for 5 years.
To maintain that masquerade for half a decade, she must have been fully integrated.
Oh, she was. To function successfully, she had to act, dress, and likely even worship like a Persian. And Mordecai, her guardian, encouraged this. It's an uncomfortable truth. God is working through the political system to protect the nation, using people who are eager to preserve their Jewish identity but seem to show little personal desire to adhere strictly to God's law.
And that's the thematic core we need to hold on to. God uses people who are only partially committed to him, and their success is a testament to his faithfulness, not theirs.
Indeed, it sets the stage for the dramatic entrance of the villain and the actual crisis.
Let's move to that now. Haman's vengeance and the seeds of genocide. Before Haman even appears, though, we get this first instance of God's providential preparation.
All thanks to Mordecai's position at the gate.
It's a beautiful piece of dramatic foreshadowing.
It is. Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, a high-traffic, trusted position, and he overheard a specific clandestine conversation. 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, were plotting to assassinate Ahasuerus.
And Mordecai immediately informed Esther, who then relayed it to the king in Mordecai's name.
The conspirators were hanged, and most importantly for the plot, the act was officially recorded in the king's daily chronicles.
And this is where the unseen hand of providence first moves.
Yes. Ahasuerus, still consumed with his vast power and probably preoccupied, overlooks rewarding Mordecai, his own savior. This oversight, coupled with the fact that Mordecai's loyalty is now permanently recorded in the royal archives, is God's setup for the nation's deliverance years later.
So the mechanism of reversal is already in place.
The outcome was never in doubt. So 4 years after Esther became queen, Haman, the antagonist, arrives.
The catalyst for the genocide. Ahasuerus promotes Haman the Agagite. He exalts him above all other officials, granting him immense power.
And the king commanded everyone at the gate to bow and pay him homage.
And Mordecai, true to his stubborn character, refused. He just stated simply that he was a Jew.
Right. And you have to ask, why this refusal? Was it purely religious? Refusing to bow to a man?
The sources suggest it's deeper than that.
Much deeper. Especially since Mordecai had already made so many compromises. This refusal, it sprang from an ancient tribal ethnic enmity. The text specifies Haman as an Agagite, and we need to pause here for a second.
Please do. That lineage sounds incredibly specific.
It is. Haman was a descendant of the Amalekites, a nation marked by God as the perpetual enemy of Israel. After the Exodus, the Amalekites attacked the weakest and most vulnerable of the Israelites in the wilderness.
And because of this, God commanded Israel to wipe out their memory.
Exactly. And how does Mordecai fit in? Well, he was a Benjaminite, tracing his lineage back to Kish, the father of King Saul. And the central drama happened in 1 Samuel 15, where the prophet Samuel commanded Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites, including their king, Agag.
And Saul failed to do it. He spared Agag.
He did. So Haman the Agagite is a direct spiritual, maybe even literal descendant of Agag, and Mordecai the Benjaminite is a descendant of the very family that was supposed to finish the job centuries earlier.
So Mordecai's refusal to bow wasn't just a political act. It was a continuation of a 1,000-year-old, divinely sanctioned war.
Precisely, and that detail cements the deep-seated hatred that drives Haman's plot. When Haman realized Mordecai's refusal was based on his Jewish identity, he was filled with rage. But striking Mordecai alone was, as the text says, repugnant to him.
He wanted total annihilation.
Haman's pride demanded a response commensurate with the insult. He sought to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. And again, you see the parallel satire at play. Both the king with Vashti and Haman with Mordecai were so consumed by their rage they conducted no investigation and just decided to punish an entire class of people.
The empire consistently overreacts.
Haman then cast the lot to find the most opportune day for this genocide. In the pagan ancient Near East, you couldn't make plans of this magnitude without consulting fate or using astrological guidance.
The lot was cast in the first month, Nisan, in the 12th year of Ahasuerus' reign, 474 BC.
And here is the subtle genius of providence. God's name is absent, but his control is absolute. Proverbs 16.33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." The lot indicated the best day for the extermination would be the 12th month, Adar 13.
So the lot, a pagan ritual, actually provided an immense providential delay of nearly a year.
Exactly. That delay was the difference between immediate, helpless slaughter and having sufficient time for the Jews to prepare for self-defense. If the lot had chosen the second or third month, the story would have ended very differently.
Haman then went to the king with his slander. He avoided naming the Jews directly, referring to them vaguely as a particular people that is dispersed, whose laws differed, and who do not observe the king's laws.
It's classic anti-Semitic rhetoric, claiming Jews are a fifth column, a people within the nation who are inherently disloyal because their laws conflict with the sovereign.
And the bribe he offered was astronomical. 10,000 talents of silver.
It was immense. Some estimates suggest it was 2/3 of the entire annual revenue of the Persian Empire at the time, over 375 tons of silver. Haman probably intended to recoup this by confiscating Jewish wealth afterward.
Turning genocide into a profit-making venture. And Ahasuerus, still reeling from his Greek humiliation and likely viewing the Jews as a convenient scapegoat, replied with stunning casual recklessness.
He essentially said, "Keep your money and do with those people whatever you wish," and handed over his signet ring. That single, careless act authorized the entire apparatus of the state,
So letters were dispatched to all 127 provinces.
commanding the destruction, killing, and annihilation of all Jews, youth, elderly, women, and children on Adar 13, 473 BC, and with explicit permission to loot their possessions.
It's a state-sanctioned pogrom disguised as law enforcement.
And the final line of that chapter is just so chilling. While the king and Haman sat down to drink and celebrate their legislative success, the entire city of Susa was thrown into an uproar. The perpetrators just went about their business, drinking wine, utterly disregarding the human cost.
That sets the stage for the crisis and Esther's critical decision. The city's in an uproar, and we see Mordecai's immediate visceral reaction.
It was an act of profound mourning. He tore his garments, put on sackcloth and ashes, crying out bitterly. This wasn't just personal grief, it was a communal sign of anguish. Throughout every province where the decree arrived, there was widespread fasting, weeping, sorrow.
They understood they were facing extinction.
And Esther, confined within the palace walls, didn't know the specifics, but knew something was terribly wrong. She was overcome with anguish when she heard about Mordecai.
She tried to maintain the fiction of normalcy, right? She sent him clothes.
She did, so he could remove the sackcloth, which was forbidden at the king's gate. But he refused. He needed her to understand the existential gravity of the situation. He sent her eunuch, Hathach, back with a written copy of the decree and the specific amount of the bribe, instructing Esther to go to the king and petition for her people.
And Esther's response reveals the extreme danger of the Persian court.
She hesitated because of the protocol. The law stated anyone who came uninvited to the king in the inner court was subject to immediate death unless the king extended the golden scepter. And her observation was brutally honest. She had not been invited to the king for 30 days.
30 days. In a volatile court like Susa, that silence alone suggests her position was already tenuous. But Mordecai's reply is the pivot point of the entire book.
It is the doctrine of providence, articulated perfectly, perhaps the most famous speech in the Old Testament. His response begins with a sober warning. Don't imagine that because you are part of the king's household, you will be the one Jew who will escape.
He makes it clear that neutrality is impossible. Silence is complicity.
And then comes the core insight. He says, if you keep quiet at this time, liberation and protection for the Jews will appear from another source, while you and your father's household perish. It may very well be that you have achieved royal status for such a time as this.
That is a stunning statement of faith, particularly from a man who has lived a life of political compromise.
He's revealing this deep foundational belief in God's absolute sovereignty. He acknowledges that God's plan, the preservation of Israel, will be accomplished irrespective of human obedience. God is not dependent on Esther.
God will accomplish his objective with or without her.
Exactly. It reframes the call to action entirely. It calls us not out of God's need for us, but for our need to find purpose in serving him. The preservation of Israel is necessary for the Messianic line, and that's guaranteed. Esther simply has the opportunity to be the agent of that deliverance or be swept away by her fear.
After this incredible challenge, Esther agrees. Her resolution is one of the most powerful lines in the narrative. If I perish, I perish.
It is the moment she casts aside her personal safety for the sake of her people. But first, she requests an immediate 3-day fast night and day for all the Jews in Susa, including herself and her attendants.
And let's consider the timing of that fast. The decree was dispatched on Nisan 13, just before Passover.
A fascinating, if painful, historical detail. If the Jews began fasting on the eve of Passover and continued for 3 days, they would have necessarily violated the explicit law commanding Passover observance.
The crisis was so severe, the threat so total, that their
Even at the cost of immediate ritual obedience. And our sources remind us that this 3-day period of humiliation and intercession carries a symbolic weight, paralleling the 3-day period of Jesus' death and subsequent triumph.
It really drives home the severity of the crisis. Esther's willingness to risk everything is why she is honored to this day. She moved from self-preservation to self-sacrifice.
Which brings us to the tides turning: insomnia, irony, and exposure.
On the 3rd day of the fast, Esther approached the king and was immediately granted favor. The gold scepter was extended.
God controlled the heart of the king. He immediately had his attention. The king, in a moment of emotional susceptibility, promised her up to half the kingdom.
But Esther, showing her political acumen, didn't make a request immediately. She was strategic.
Very strategic. She knew Xerxes operated on impulse. A direct accusation might have ended in her death. So she invited the king and Haman to a banquet that day, and then, delaying again, invited them both to a second banquet the next day.
It adds this intense dramatic tension, while also elevating Haman's sense of self-importance.
Haman left that first banquet pleased and very much encouraged, believing he was the most favored man in the entire Persian Empire. His cup of pride was overflowing, but then right outside the king's gate, he saw Mordecai, who still refused to rise.
And Haman was instantly consumed with rage.
All his wealth, his promotion, his power, his 10 sons, none of it satisfied him so long as I have to see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate.
It is a profound psychological insight into the nature of deep-seated hatred. Success is meaningless if his enemy is still breathing.
Exactly. His wife, Zeresh, and his friends advised him to capitalize on this anger immediately. They told him to build a massive gallows, 75 feet high, tall enough for the whole city to see, and tell the king in the morning to hang Mordecai on it.
And Haman, in his typical haste and arrogance, had the gallows built that very night, which sets up the absolute pinnacle of the story's irony.
Because that very night, the invisible hand of God moves again. The king couldn't sleep. This trivial detail, Ahasuerus' insomnia, is the hinge upon which the survival of the chosen nation rests.
I love that. This massive, world-altering event hinges on something so ordinary as a ruler being restless in his bed.
It highlights the literary strategy of the book. Instead of divine thunderbolts, we get a sleepless night. The king, desperate for diversion, asked for the royal chronicles to be read aloud to him.
The equivalent of the most boring government record being read at 3 a.m.
The perfect cure for insomnia. But this night, Providence ensured that the reader stumbled upon the precise account of Mordecai exposing the plot of Bigthan and Teresh years earlier. The king realized he had never honored Mordecai for saving his life.
The oversight, previously ignored, now became a pressing matter of state honor.
And right at that moment, Haman, full of his own plan for vengeance, arrives in the outer courtyard. The irony is breathtaking. He came to request permission to hang Mordecai on the huge, brand-new gallows he'd just finished building.
But before he could utter his request, the king intercepts him with the most loaded question possible. What should be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?
And Haman's supreme arrogance blinded him. He thought the honor could only be for him. His mind, consumed by status, immediately went to the highest possible display of public adulation.
He recommended the works: royal attire, the king's own horse, a noble official leading him through the city, proclaiming his honor.
He wanted to essentially be paraded as a temporary king, and the command that followed must have just shattered his mind. Ahasuerus ordered him, "Go quickly, take the clothing and the horse, and do exactly what you just indicated to Mordecai the Jew."
The humiliation was immediate and total. Imagine Haman having to parade his archenemy through the streets of Susa, publicly proclaiming his honor.
It's the ultimate reversal of fortune, a complete psychological torment. Haman, utterly distraught, obeyed. Afterward, he hurried home, mournful and covering his head, a profound sign of deep grief.
And his friends and his wife Zeresh were the first to recognize the supernatural shift.
They told him, "If indeed this Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is Jewish, you will not prevail against him. No, you will surely fall before him." They immediately understood that Haman had picked a fight with a people backed by an unseen force.
The tide had definitively turned. and he was then immediately rushed to the second banquet.
Still reeling from the humiliation, little realizing it would be the scene of his condemnation and death.
Which brings us to justice and the second decree. Haman arrives at the banquet, and the king again asks Esther her request.
And Esther had executed her strategic delay perfectly. Now was the time for her final, powerful move. Her plea was direct and devastating for Haman. She appealed first for her own life, identifying herself as Jewish for the first time, and the life of her people.
She says they had been sold for destruction and annihilation by an enemy.
The king was utterly surprised, likely stunned that this beloved queen had kept her background secret for 5 years and that his most trusted official, Haman, had set him up to murder his own queen. He asked, "Who is this individual? Where is this person?"
And Esther delivered the fatal blow. The oppressor and enemy is this evil Haman.
Haman was instantly terrified. The consequences were immediate. In a rage, the king withdrew to the palace garden to compose himself.
And Haman, knowing his end was determined, fell onto the couch where Esther was, begging for his life.
When the king returned, he saw Haman pleading at Esther's couch, and in a fit of interpretive rage, he misinterpreted the scene, exclaiming, "Will he also attempt to rape the queen while I am still in the building?" This was the final justification he needed.
And the final beautiful piece of irony came from the eunuch Harbona,
who immediately pointed out the 75-foot gallows Haman had just built for Mordecai, who spoke out on the king's behalf. The irony is complete. The king's command was swift and final. Hang him on it. Haman was ensnared in his own trap.
Justice was meted out, and immediately Esther and Mordecai were rewarded.
Esther received Haman's vast estate, and Mordecai was elevated to Haman's place as second in authority, receiving the king's signet ring. This placed him in a position of power previously occupied by Joseph and Daniel, a Jew, as the second most powerful man in the world.
But the central dilemma remained. Haman was dead, but the original decree, the unrepealable law to destroy the Jews, was still on the books.
This is the frustrating reality of Persian bureaucracy. The law was unchangeable. Esther wept and begged for mercy, knowing that while Haman was gone, the threat was still legally enforceable.
So how do you solve the legal problem of an unchangeable law commanding genocide?
The king, after listening to Esther's plea, confirmed he lacked the authority to cancel the original decree. But he provided a brilliant legal loophole, the second decree. He authorized Mordecai to write a new edict in the king's name, sealed with the king's signet ring. This went out on June 25, 474 BC.
So this new law didn't technically cancel the first one, but it completely neutralized its intended effect.
Absolutely. The original law still said that people could kill Jews on Adar 13. But the new law allowed the Jews in every city to assemble, stand up for themselves, destroy, kill, and annihilate any army that became their adversaries.
It was an authorization for mass self-defense.
And crucially, they now had over 8 months to prepare, organize, and arm themselves. This completely removed the enemy's original advantage of surprise.
It's a powerful theological analogy, isn't it? The first decree, the law of condemnation for sin, cannot be repealed.
That's the application our sources suggest. The first decree remains, but the second decree, the message of saving grace, provides the legal and spiritual means to avert the terrible effects of the first. It provides the authorization to fight back.
The aftermath and victory arrived on March 7, 473 BC.
The sources detail the scale of the defense. The Jews assembled. The sheer dread of them fell upon all people, and importantly, all the local officials and governors assisted the Jews because of the immense political influence and dread of Mordecai. The structure of the empire was now working for them.
The numbers of the adversaries killed are staggering. 500 men in Susa, including Haman's 10 sons, and in the provinces, 75,000.
Esther then made one final, hard-edged request after the first day of fighting in Susa. She asked for a second day of defense and to hang Haman's 10 executed sons on the gallows.
Why the request to display the bodies? It seems unnecessarily harsh.
It was for maximum public disgrace and as a severe deterrent. Hanging the bodies of the 10 sons, the line of the Agagite on that 75-foot gallows, served as a clear, unmistakable warning to any future enemies. It was an act of national security.
And an essential detail about the fighting is recorded right after the victory. The Jews deliberately did not confiscate their property.
This is perhaps the most crucial novelty of the entire violent conflict. In a culture where victors were expected to take spoil, this act of self-denial was revolutionary. It was absolute proof of their upright motives. They were fighting solely in self-defense, not for greed.
That brings us to the legacy, the establishment of Purim, and final reflections.
The immediate aftermath saw celebration. The Jews in the provinces rested on Adar 14, making it a day of banqueting and happiness. The Jews in Susa, who fought an extra day, rested on Adar 15. Mordecai then decreed the annual observance of both days.
And the holiday was formally named Purim, the plural form of pur, the lot.
The name itself serves as a constant, symbolic reminder of how God used the very mechanism of pagan fate, the lot casting intended to determine their doom to ultimately deliver them.
And Purim was established as days of feasting, happiness, sending gifts, and providing for the poor.
Solidifying their remembrance of this delivery, Mordecai himself achieved final greatness, becoming second only to Ahasuerus, admired by his relatives, and working enthusiastically for the good of his people.
He was a true statesman.
He was, joining the ranks of these great diaspora leaders like Joseph and Daniel. However, we must return to the central thematic conflict. The book highlights God's unwavering faithfulness despite his people's significant unfaithfulness.
We've established that Esther and Mordecai chose the comfort of Persian life over returning to Jerusalem. They were eager to preserve their nation and religion when threatened, but showed little evidence of strong personal daily piety.
Their conduct contrasts dramatically with the piety of figures like Daniel and Nehemiah. The writer of Esther is essentially making a sophisticated argument. God's fidelity to his covenant is not conditioned on the flawless obedience of his people. God still watched over and delivered them.
So if we take a step back and synthesize the core lesson, what does this book teach us about the nature of divine action in the world?
The central lesson remains the power of providence, the careful ongoing work of God in the details of history. The writer's deliberate omission of God's name is a brilliant literary strategy that ironically amplifies his power. It shows that even seemingly trivial random events, a deposed queen, a delayed lot, a king's sudden insomnia, are orchestrated for a singular divine purpose. God is operating in the margins and in the palace.
That's a powerful way to synthesize this highly complex text. But that final tension between Mordecai's greatness and their lack of personal piety deserves one last provocative thought for you to consider as you wrap up this deep dive.
We've seen that God can and does use people like Esther and Mordecai, who chose comfort over commandment and were not fully committed to his will personally, to accomplish his grand design. This raises a crucial question for reflection. If God's sovereign plan unfolds regardless of human perfection, what does this imply about the relationship between your personal piety and his work in the world? Is God's use of you dependent on your perfect devotion, or is it solely dependent on his unwavering covenant faithfulness? The ultimate model for this tension, of course, is Jesus, who laid aside all self-fulfillment for the purpose of absolute servanthood.